Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I always worry when I stand up to talk to a crowd like this. I get a little nervous. And I think the only way to confront my nerves is just to put it out there. I'm not the other Bill Murray. I'm not this guy, just so you know, okay? And I don't want to disappoint you because I'm not funny. If I am funny, it's completely by accident. The good news is Bill Murray and I have a couple different things that we share. I'm from New Jersey. Bill's from New Jersey. Bill is Hollywood royalty. I worked in Hollywood for 22 years. Bill also has an ownership interest in a place called Harold's Cabin, where they serve coffee. Now, I don't have an ownership interest in much of anything, but I served a lot of coffee to people over the years, not specialty coffee. When I was in college, I worked third shift in a convenience store, the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. I served a lot of coffee. Coffee keeps that kind of place, open and alive. It's funny how life loops around. I learned quite a lot in that position. I learned, for example, that osmosis really works. I mean, when you work 11 to 7 and go to an 8 o'clock accounting class, the only way you're going to learn accounting is when it absorbs in you automatically. You're not going to learn it because you're paying attention. I learned some other things too. I learned that transaction, when you're giving somebody a cup of coffee, is very often as much about respect as anything else. People that would come into the store with food stamps, they'd fallen into the safety net. They were afraid to look at you. They didn't want a look of disapproval when they took out their food stamp booklet. Or people that walked in and tossed money at you, telling you something about what they thought about you and the work you did. Or when you're cleaning a bathroom at 4 o'clock in the morning and you're thinking, wow, do people do this at home too? Look at this, It taught me a lot of things. It taught me how to respect people in jobs like that. I had one of those jobs. Like here, for example, our AV guys. I always think about our AV guys as AV ninjas. They're all dressed in black, they're silent, and they're deadly. With a flick of a button, they can kill me up here, just like that. And so thank you, AV guys, for everything you're doing to make us look so good up here. Really appreciate this. Absolutely. But I learned something about the beverage business, watching people walk in and walk out all day long and all night long. I watched the brand loyalists. They'd walk back to that big wall of beverages. They took exactly what they wanted, and they'd walk right out. Other people spent a little more time looking at that wall of beverages. And ironically, 30 years later, I find myself at the National Coffee Association, where we produce a coffee drinking trends report. And how do we start that report? We start by looking at the overall picture. What are people drinking overall in terms of beverages? And then we drill in. And we drill it in, and we drill in. So it was kind of ironic. About 2 months ago, I took a trip out to this college that I attended when I was working in this convenience store. I do some volunteer work out there. And a piece came on the TV the night before I went to the college. It was about bootleggers. Bootleggers, people that buy stuff, don't pay taxes, and move it from one jurisdiction to another. What kind of bootleggers might these have been? Moonshiners. This is in Pennsylvania, but outside of Philadelphia. Cigarette bootleggers, medical marijuana bootleggers. These were actually soda bootleggers. Anybody from Philadelphia? Anybody from the area see what's happening in Philly? The Philadelphia city government passed a tax, 1.5 cents per ounce on soda. People are now getting in their cars or driving across the city line. They're loading up their station wagons with 2-liter bottles of soda. They're driving back to Philadelphia and enjoying their soda. The business is in an uproar. So the question right now isn't really about soda, is it? The analysts are looking at this, and they're saying, what does this mean for soda? What does it mean for coffee? Does it mean anything for coffee? Well, as a matter of fact, over just the past couple of months, there were 2 separate proposals to specifically tax coffee at opposite ends of the country, Oregon and Vermont. And to understand what's happening, it helps to look a little more deeply, look beyond the tip of the iceberg to see what's really happening here. And here's what's happening. All across the country, states are facing fiscal deficits. They've got to pay for new bridges. They've got to pay for pensions. They've got to pay for schools. They're running huge budget deficits. In just 3 states, and these are just the first 3 letters of the alphabet, we're talking about $6-7 billion deficits. Now, if you're a politician, you got to come up with that money. And one way to do this is to increase income taxes. So if we were a state, we would tax everybody in this room to pay for that. But if you're a politician and you want to get reelected, that's not a good idea. Because nobody in this room is going to be happy, and they're less likely to vote for you when you run for reelection. So here's what's happening. As lawmakers look to raise money to plug these deficits, instead of raising everybody's taxes, what they prefer to do is just to raise your taxes and your taxes and your taxes in the form of taxes on alcohol or cigarettes or now soda and coffee. Now, in some cases, some of these cases, you can make an argument and you can say, okay, you know what? For alcohol, cigarettes, there's some health issues. Maybe there's some connection between taxing these things. But the reality is these taxes are completely arbitrary. What's the biggest thing you can do for your health? We all know, we hear this over and over and over again, get up and exercise. What's the biggest impediment to getting up and exercising? That big, beautiful flat-screen TV you have at home. Why isn't there a $500 tax on all TVs that goes to pay for the cardiac care unit at your local hospital? These things are arbitrary. So by looking at the tip of the iceberg, the tax, something that seems to be completely unrelated, we're now seeing what's happening from a policy perspective and what it might mean for us. And we're connecting things that at first blush seem to have no connection at all. Taxes on soda, coffee, and our business. I mention this being the tip of the iceberg because I tend to think of these issues, these policy questions, as iceberg-like issues. We tend to see just the surface. We see the regulation, we see the headline. But there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. And as the folks on the Titanic found out, you got to pay attention to the rest of the iceberg as well to understand it and avoid it. I was in Iceland about 2 months ago. I do landscape photography in my spare time. January in Iceland, it was beautiful. It was raining. It was snowing. It was actually really cool. And there's this beach where there's this beautiful array of ice on the beach. There's a glacier right next to the beach. Pieces of the glacier break off. They wash off into the North Atlantic. They wash up on the beach. And photographers like myself, we go out there at dawn, we get on our knees in freezing cold water, and we take pictures of this. We try to catch the sun behind it. The ice is mesmerizing. It's blue. It's iridescent. It's 2,000 years old. But if you forget where you are and you forget to look up, you'll forget that you're on the edge of the North Atlantic. And every year, people doing this, mesmerized by a detail, get swept out to sea. I tend to think of regulation like this. We get so focused on what we're doing. We're so busy. I would suggest that now more than ever is a really good time to look up from the day-to-day issues that keep you really busy and think about those waves that might be on the horizon, and here's why. Nothing I say today is meant as a political comment, nothing. But we've just elected as a nation someone who says no more business as usual. He's going to change the rules. He's going to do it all differently. The theme today is about risk. That creates risks. Let's look at just one issue in particular, the border tax. You might remember during the election last year, there was talk about a manufacturer of air conditioners and about that manufacturer moving jobs to Mexico, where they could produce those air conditioners more cheaply, import them into the US, and the issue, as it was for much of the election, was about lost American jobs. So what's being talked about? A tax, a different kind of wall. Not a wall, but a tariff wall, a 20% border tax. The idea is that manufacturers would lose the cost advantage of producing outside the country and bring that manufacturing back to the US. But what does it mean for coffee? Suppose the price of all the coffee that you're importing goes up by 20%, along with everything else that you're importing for your shop and for your business. The irony here in particular is that if you want to think about this in a manufacturing construct, by and large, the manufacturing of coffee, is being done here. You're roasting it, you're grinding it, you're packing it, you're shipping it, you're marketing it. That's all happening here. So it's ironic that something that's intended to preserve jobs in America could end up having exactly the opposite effect. If the price of your coffee goes up by 20%, you're going to have to pass some of that along. That's likely to mean that some people are going to drink less coffee or no coffee at all, which means that there will be fewer jobs roasting and grinding and packing and delivering coffee. Now, businesses all across the country are wondering about this right now. What does this mean? What's the border tax going to do? We need to think about this too. These are the types of issues that as you think about risks to your business and the policy-making environment, whether you're in specialty coffee or commercial coffee, these have the real potential to change your business, or hurt your business, or to support it. Let's just talk about a couple of other little quick issues here, things that came up last year. If you're selling packaged coffee, you don't have an obligation right now to put a nutrition facts panel on your coffee. Why? Because the amount of nutrients in coffee, as declared under certain statutes, don't go over a threshold. But every so often, the FDA looks at how much coffee we're drinking, how much we're consuming. And what they've decided is that the average amount of coffee in a serving has gone up from about 6 ounces to 8 ounces, meaning there's just enough potassium now in a cup of coffee to make it obligatory to put this panel on your package. Right now, the FDA has said, we're going to use discretion. We're not going to put this obligation into effect, but they could. What would that mean for your business? Let's take a look at something else that happened last year, the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. This act in particular makes importers responsible for the conditions under which those things they're importing were produced. Which means what? Which means that if customs suspects that your coffee was produced using forced or involuntary labor, they could withhold the release of that coffee. You now have an obligation to not only look into your supply chain, but to be able to prove that you took reasonable steps. Now, I think we'd all agree that's the right thing to do. But you want to make sure you don't get hung up on a paperwork or a legal technicality having it hurt your business. Let's go back to labeling for a second. GMO, another hot topic. Ironically, this isn't something that at the moment we're concerned about here. From a coffee perspective, GMO, laboratory methods to manipulate certain organisms, are not being used in coffee that's in the market right now, not an issue. But there's a roaring debate in our country. Should GMO foods be labeled? Should they not be labeled? The state of Vermont, they got tired waiting for the federal government to do something about this, so they passed a law. And the law would have required manufacturers and distributors to put labels and to keep paperwork trails on what it was that they were selling to the public. Now, whether you're for that or against that, that's not what I'm here to talk about. If Vermont can do it, every other state can do the same thing, and that became the issue. If you're selling coffee, if you're manufacturing coffee, if you're online delivering, you potentially could have had the obligation to comply with 50 different sets of rules, paperwork, packaging, labeling, and all kinds of other things, which again would impact your business. A federal law was passed in July. The feds have 2 years to implement the regulations around this. There is now a federal labeling obligation, and we'll see what it looks like in the months ahead. Last thing I'm going to talk about really goes back to that soda question for a second. These types of things don't always come out of legalities, come out of law. Sometimes you want to look a little bit upstream to see where these issues come from. Last year, the World Health Organization took a look at coffee and cancer. They wanted to determine if there was a linkage between getting cancer and drinking coffee. They hadn't looked at it in well over a decade. they concluded that coffee was even safer than they thought it was. They downgraded it. For the first time ever, they said, no, you really don't need to worry about coffee. But they also looked at very hot beverages. We're talking about mates, consumed traditionally with a metal straw in parts of South America, where you literally are scalding your mouth. The headline then became, very hot drinks may cause cancer. So what's ironic here is that the good news about coffee, consumed by over 180 million people a year in this country, got lost to the very sensational headline, warning, if what you're drinking is really hot, you should be worried about this. This is the kind of thing where lawmakers and regulators look at this, and they're looking for something to do, and they say, hey, I wonder if we should now put warning labels on packages and tell people that if it's too hot, it could be bad for them. And I think the irony here in particular is that when you look at the evidence about coffee and health, and it comes from all sorts of sources, and none of them, to my knowledge, are industry-funded, one of those big bugaboos that are out there. The news is very consistent about how good coffee is for you, for your liver, for cognitive diseases, for all types of things. So what's the point? My point this morning is not to give you a long list of regulatory issues. Last year when I was here, I talked a little bit about an economic impact study that we did. The purpose of the economic impact study that we did last year was to make sure that coffee as a sector had a place at the table in Washington and at the state level when these types of issues came up. Because what folks really care about, what lawmakers want to hear about, is who you are. And they frame that conversation in the context of how many jobs do you represent? How many voters care about what you do? How many taxes do you generate? That's what gets you to the table. So with support from SCA, we undertook the first ever study to measure this. You can find it online on our website. And what I told you last year was this was the power of coffee. But after watching the election over the last year, I want to amend that. These data points are not the power of coffee. We are. We all have our own positions, our voices, our visions. That's what lawmakers really want to hear from. Really, this really just frames all of us speaking up, getting involved, and letting lawmakers know what's going to impact us, what's practical, what's not practical. In the world of business, like in the world of life, there are rules, right? Those rules come in the form of regulations and laws. And you've got three choices, and they're very simple. Either you follow the laws, even if they make no sense, they cost you money, they hurt your business, and they don't have the intended outcome, but you can just follow the rules. Your second choice is you break them. But we're talking about laws and regulations. Doing so comes at great personal risk, comes at risk to your company. No one would advise that. But your third option is to step into the process and change the rules. Make the rules reflective of what you do, your reality, your business, your values, and how you see the world. So that's my message today. We're here to talk about that sensory experience of what's in the cup. But we know that there are externalities beyond that. We care about things like sustainability. We care about things like gender equity. We care about things like the people who pick our coffee. We should also be caring about the legal and regulatory environment that shapes what we do. Because if you look at the world that way, I think you'll find a whole new dimension to the world of coffee. And at least from my perspective, it's really interesting. And it's a whole new way to look at the world. Thanks for your time this morning. I appreciate it.